Good afternoon, everyone. I think final students might just be coming down, but my chairman, Leon Kempler, as I'm sure many of you know, has taught me that you must run everything meticulously on time, and I'm already 4 minutes late, and he'd be ashamed of me, so I'll press on. So first of all, welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I know Friday afternoon's not always the easiest time to get a group together, so it's fantastic to see a lot of familiar and some new faces as well. Particularly a welcome to our student group. It's been a great day. First month of the MBA program, which is predominantly online, but we have these events, has just been completed, and it's been a fantastic start, so it's very, very exciting. So welcome to our industry project sponsors who are here with us today, working directly with our students on real challenges they're facing, which is fantastic, and to our special guests, there'll be a proper introduction for you, but thank you very much for joining us as well. Today's been a brilliant day, as I say, on the MBA program. I think this day is sort of representative of a lot of the things that we're trying to achieve for the MBA. And that's, this morning the students have had some fantastic academic lectures. They've had times to work with their project sponsors on real projects. They've also had some brilliant sessions run by KPMG this afternoon. And now they get the opportunity to hear from some world leaders, global leaders that are part of all Ducere's courses, and the chance to hear from them directly today as well. So seeing it all come together has been fantastic. And so want to say a huge thank you to KPMG as well for hosting today, also being a project sponsor, a great supporter of this course, which we think is hugely valuable and is going to be of major significance for business education in Australia, and that's through the work of the people at Ducere and the fantastic work of the University of Canberra that we've developed this program in partnership with. So to introduce our panel and say a few words, first of all, I'd like to welcome Rob BAZANI. He is the Chairman of Partners for Victoria for KPMG. He's also the National Managing Partner of Private Enterprise Practice for KPMG in Australia. And KPMG have been a key partner of ours. Their innovation and their happiness to support the program and to drive things along has been wonderful. So we're very appreciative. And Rob, please come to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Well, thank you, Jack, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As I had a very nice introduction there, as you'd know, I'm the chairman here at KPMG, and we're absolutely proud and very, very happy to have this opportunity to sponsor this session here today. On behalf of KPMG, I'd like to welcome everyone here to the Ducere MBA Innovation and Leadership launch on behalf of KPMG, and we hope that we can do this many, many times for the future. We're particularly excited to see students here, a tremendous panel that I'll introduce in a moment, but it's also absolutely aligned to what we are trying to do here at KPMG, which is effectively stay up to date with what is happening both in the business world and in the education world as well. So in that regard, we're very proud to be here and pushing forward innovation and leadership, and particularly with a university and a program such as this. Bringing together a not-for-profit, the education sector and industry, while we also prepare MBA graduates for the complex business challenges that lie ahead, is something what KPMG is aiming to do and invest in. And we're also very glad to be able to support philanthropic programs as we do so. It's hard to believe that you can talk business this day and age without talking about innovation, and adding that to an MBA program we believe is innovative in itself. And it's very hard to believe, and I did an MBA many years ago, and back then I probably would have had to look up a dictionary to work out what innovation was, let alone what it meant, and let alone how do you inculcate it into what you do day to day. Being an industry partner really helps bring practical experience for us as a business and mesh it with education and education facilities, and also what we can get from our MBA graduates today. With that in mind, it's absolute pleasure to be able to welcome our guests here at the panel. The first member, the Honourable Julia Gillard, really requires no introduction. She was Australia's first Prime Minister and recently appointed the Chancellor of Ducere.
Female?
Female Prime Minister.
Be quite old.
It's actually there.
I
thought I'd just test everyone. But more importantly, she legislated and pushed reforms across a tremendous range of areas, from education, carbon pricing, disability care, health and aged care. A life very much dedicated to enhancing educational opportunities and well-being for the people in Australia and for the people around the world, and we thank you very much for that. The second member, the Honourable Alan Stockdale, has had a significant effect and influence in Australian business and politics, and he has an extensive career in that regard. As many of you will know, he was the Victorian Treasurer from 1992 to 1999 and led a tremendous reform in this economy and in this great state that ultimately transformed this state for what it is today. He was also chairman of Macquarie Bank's infrastructure group, led many successful transactions in that regard, and he's also chairman of a number of ASX-listed companies, and retired from the Victorian Parliament in 1999. And we welcome you, Alan, and we thank you again for your tremendous contribution to this great state that we have. And our third panel speaker and guest is Professor Lawrence Pratchett, Dean of the Faculty of Business and Government at the University of Canberra since 2011, an esteemed academic and thinker, and we very much welcome you here today as well, Professor. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to KPMG, to the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Canberra, Professor Stephen Parker. Please, Stephen, thank you very much for joining us, and your wife as well. It's a pleasure to have you here as well. So please welcome, before we start, give them a round of applause for being here today. And of course, the topic of today is leadership and innovation. And I'll now hand over to Professor Lawrence to kick off the panel. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Rob. Okay, just some very quick opening remarks from me. We've spent the whole day talking about leadership and innovation, and that's really what I want this to be about as well, because we have with us two remarkable leaders who have had amazing careers and have a wealth of experience to share with us in relation to innovation and leadership. We'll focus, therefore, on those experiences. I know it's really, really tempting to want to ask them to comment on contemporary policies and politics, but I actually think that we have so many other opportunities to hear both Julia and Alan comment in the media, on the TV, on the radio, and so on, about those issues, that we'd be missing an opportunity if we just get them to rehearse the same arguments they would have around those things. So I really want us to focus our questions on innovation and leadership today. The idea is that I'm going to ask a couple of questions, but I'm also going to invite the students who have already submitted questions to ask some of their questions as we go. I will give you a hint as to which question I'm asking you to ask, so that you've got some idea of where I'm trying to go with this. And then towards the end, we'll open it up to more general questions, which is when you can get in all those things that you've really been desperate to ask Julia and Alan as we go. So if I could just start with what is, I think in Australia you call it the Dorothy Dix, really. But it is a question really about what do you think are your biggest strengths as a leader? But I'd also like, as you're thinking about that, to tell me about what your biggest weaknesses have been as well, and what you did to cover for those. I'll come to you first, Julia, and then Alan. So Julia first.
Thank you very much. That wouldn't qualify as a Dorothy Dix question, because Dorothy Dix question in question time is, can you please tell us about the government's magnificent achievements on the following? So the fact you put in the weaknesses bit, it's going to disqualify it. Strengths as a leader, I would hope I could say about myself that I'm someone who always had a sense of purpose, that I knew what I was trying to achieve and was driven by achieving it. And I think I would like to also be able to say about myself that despite a lot of noise and static, particularly during the period that I was Prime Minister, that I managed to stay true to that purpose and to make that the the thing that I predominantly did, though there were many things competing for my attention, and the thing that I wanted to be judged by. So I would say that. On weaknesses, I was conscious of this as it was happening, but it was very difficult to correct, and I think it's a lesson of general application, which is in this very connected age, never has the urgent been more privileged over the important. I think throughout human history, the urgent has been privileged in some ways over the important, but never has it been so privileged, because you're always, something's buzzing in your pocket, ringing in your purse. There's always something that is trying to command your attention. And I was conscious in government that that was the case. And as Deputy Prime Minister and then Prime Minister, I had a practice of what I referred to as going into the cone time, which of course was a reference to Maxwell Smart, the cone of silence. What else would you be talking about in the Prime Minister's office except Maxwell Smart? And I used to say to all of the staff, I am in the cone, which was code for I am not to be interrupted unless someone declares war on Australia, in which case you better get me, because I'm trying to get, quiet, unplugged thinking, planning time. And looking back on it now, I wish that I had been far more disciplined about that. And not only far more disciplined about time by myself to think and plan, but also time with the best of colleagues and advisors, and by that I mean people within the political system and beyond the political system. But the crush of the urgent didn't enable me, or I didn't enable myself to carve out enough time. So if I had one lesson to impart, it would certainly be that precious, deep thinking, strategising time. You've got to have it, and you need to wrestle with everything else to push it back and to clear the agenda for it.
What a great start, Julia. Thank you. Alan, what was your big achievements in... Oh, no, sorry, that's a Dorothy Dix. So the same question to you, really, which is strengths, but also a reflection possibly on weaknesses and how you managed them.
Well, I'll try to say something different from Julia, because what she said makes so much sense that obviously everybody who has a leadership task is going to have to approach it in much the same way. I would reiterate her first point, though. I think a very clear vision of what you are trying to achieve, and I would suspect that Julia and I are very much alike in the sense that once we get the idea, we then spend an enormous amount of time mulling it over in our head and trying to refine and understand exactly what does it involve. The second thing, and I'm sure the same thing's true of her, was I do the work. I was very fortunate that very early on in my career, working with a fellow who's no longer with me as a lay advocate in an employers association, he said to me, if you ever use a quarter of what you prepared, you are underprepared. So I always worked really hard to make sure that we'd not only prepared the things we were trying to do and could explain then to other people, but we thought about what else could come up along the way. Now, when you undertake something as significant as privatising the old State Electricity Commission, you have to realise that you're not going to get everything right. And the real test is, do you get on to things that are going wrong early and do you correct them? Do you not have to wait until the thing's been operating for 10 years before somebody says, listen, you really mucked that up? And I think that was a great strength of what we did in the privatisation initiatives in the 90s, that we had really, really good people, surrounded ourselves with good people, worked them hard, made sure they thought broadly, and then took all the credit for their work. The other thing I would say is that I went to meet with Roger Douglas when I was in opposition, and some of you are probably too young to remember Roger Douglas. He was a great reforming treasurer in New Zealand, Labor treasurer, finance minister as they call them. And at the end of a very long session with him, I said to him, so Roger, if I only ever recall one thing out of our discussion, what should it be? And he thought for a moment and he said, whenever I was undertaking a major reform, I always spent 50% of the time, allocated 50% of the time for planning, the marketing and the persuasion. I should have allocated a higher proportion. And that was something that was really with me through my political career, where I had a great opportunity to achieve more than most people do in politics because of the circumstances and because of the people I worked with, particularly with Jeff Kennett, who is a first-rate leader. As far as weaknesses would go, I think probably Jeff would sum it up as, you just worry about the ideas and I'll handle the politics. That I've never been really as good as I needed to be, I think, in persuading people in a broader forum. I could persuade people in a small group or with a team I was working with, and I think I can modestly claim to have been fairly good at that, but I don't think I was particularly good at explaining to people who didn't share my views why we were doing it and what the benefits would be. I wish I had been better at that.
Thank you, Alan. Again, different but inspirational. Can I then really start us off on a journey here by really starting to talk about your learning journey to being a leader rather than talking about what you now know. So is Chris Thomas in the audience? Good. Chris, you had a question about the sort of defining moment of becoming a leader. Would you like to ask it?
Thank you. I will ask it of both of you. Leaders come every day and go every day. Not everyone reaches the lofty heights of executive leadership, and not everyone gets to lead a state or a nation. If you think back to your lives, what was that defining moment that gave you the confidence that you could fulfill an aspiration to lead at the highest level?
Well, I'll try and answer that and then hand over to Alan. It's a great question. For me, really, it was a sense of purpose and mission that came first, and getting leadership skills and thinking about my future ability as a leader that came second. So I, went to university in Adelaide with just the expectation that I'd go through my law degree and my arts degree, and I'd come out and I'd get a job as a lawyer, and that was already big time for me. I come from a family background where my sister and I were the first in our family to go to university. My mother didn't, my father didn't. Only one person in my father's siblings did. He was one of 7. So, to get to the gates of a university was a big time thing. And you thought if I could come out of those gates in a few years' time with 2 qualifications, that'd be fantastic. But as it was, there was some big cutbacks to education whilst I was at university, and I thought that was wrong. I had a sense of privilege about being there, and I thought that privilege should be shared by others. So I got involved in the cause of trying to roll back those education cutbacks, and we got, had a little bit of success, not complete success, but the government backed down on a few things. And so it was that journey that then took me into student unionism at a national level, that brought me here as a young person. I moved to Melbourne when I was 20. I look back on it now and think you're just how naive that you can get in your car with your trailer and your little bits of stuff and your cardboard boxes and move city and never think anything could go wrong. And fortunately, nothing did go wrong of any significance. And I ended up, through that, leading the Australian Union of Students, which is remembered now for a series of controversial political agendas, but I was in the era past that. We were the quiet ones at the end of the process. But being the quiet ones at the end of the process, I still, as a 21-year-old, was running an organisation with a budget of $440,000, which in the early 1980s was real money, $440,000. And had paid staff, people whose livelihoods, they weren't students having a moonlighting job, they were people whose livelihoods depended on getting a regular paycheck, education research officers and the like. And that gave me a sense of what it was like to lead a team internally, to try and communicate externally and take people on a journey and a vision. And it was only then that the penny dropped for me that it was possible for me to think about leadership in broader contexts, particularly politics. And so if the Fraser government hadn't cut university spending in those crucial years, I might well be a suburban solicitor in Adelaide right now. But there was just that change moment for me, and I guess I grabbed it.
I'm now really regretting the decision to ban politics and current policy because my Vice-Chancellor has been very outspoken on certain policies recently. Alan, can I invite you to address the same question, the defining moment for you?
I don't think there's any single defining moment that develops you to have the confidence to take on a leadership role. When I look back over my own life, I had a family that really encouraged me to do whatever I wanted to try. Have a go was the creed of our family, and the family would support me to do that. Then I went to Melbourne High School, and there was a really conscious focus on leadership and excellence in the school. Melbourne Grammar, and I had a wide range of student activities outside my studies, which probably accounts for the fact that I think I went in as the highest credentialed, or at least in terms of matriculation marks, the highest credentialed law student in my intake, and scraped out with a compensatory pass in public international law. But I had a ball, and I think without realising it at the time, I learned a great deal. And all through those periods of times, I was very conscious of the fact that the people who were educating me and with whom I was mixing, almost to a person, had a commitment to excellence. They wanted to see people do their best, and they wanted to do something about making our society better. Not so much, I didn't have the same sort of pointed interest in one particular issue that Julia describes, in which I guess explains what she's doing now and what was so abundantly clear during her time in the Parliament, that she had a passionate interest in education. I had a much more diffuse sort of ambition. And I think it is true, and I've actually said this many, many times before, that politics is a bit of a corrupting business, but the vast majority, if not all, of the people who enter Parliament on both sides and all sides really do so in the beginning because they want to play a part in making the state, the country, whatever it is, better. And some of them get corrupted along the way with ambition and other things, but it's still, I think, underestimated by the general public the extent to which politicians are committed to trying and improve the society. We mightn't agree about what it requires to improve it, but the objective is to make life better for people. And the other great thing, and you don't need me to tell you this, you've no doubt all read many, many books and articles and journals that draw attention to the importance of mentoring. I was extremely fortunate through my early working life in particular, but really throughout my working life until I left the Parliament, to have very strong mentors, people who took an interest in me, thought I had potential, and helped me develop that. And that was incredibly important. The guy I mentioned to you before, I worked with him in 2 periods in an industry association, once just for 12 months and then for about 2.5 years. And I learned an enormous amount from him because he saw himself as a mentor for me. And I think the importance of mentoring can't possibly be overstated. It's really significant. It's how you accelerate the whole learning process, and it also helps you to identify goals. And if you're dealing with people of just fundamentally good character, which I've been fortunate to do, they reinforce all that desire to do something to make the world better. Just this morning on radio, the Minister for Social Services said that he'd really taken to heart that when he became the Secretary of the Liberal Party in New South Wales, John Howard said to him, the best way to get ahead is to do your job as well as you possibly can. And I think that's very sound advice.
Thank you, Alan. I'm going to go straight to Zia Berend. Are you here, Zia? Oh, just convenient. You sat next to each other. This is almost as if we planned it. Zia, you were going to ask a question about lessons from good and bad decisions.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from both of you about a time as a leader when you've made a good decision and what you learnt from that, and a time when you've made a bad decision and what you've learnt from that.
That's a good question too. Good decisions, I mean, in public policy, the best decisions are ones that have the right vision, the right aim, and Alan's just talked about the aim of improving circumstances for people, but also have a sufficient lead up that you can work the idea through, not only internally within the government structures, but that you can work it through with the community as well. So to give you an example of that, as Federal Education Minister, I conceived of the idea of us knowing as a nation, all of us, each of us knowing as a nation how individual schools are going, what they're achieving in literacy and numeracy, in the context of understanding what kinds of kids go to the school, the level of advantage and disadvantage, and ultimately in the context of how much money the school gets. And I wanted through that to transform the education conversation from public versus private to individual schools, and the funding conversation from sectors competing for dollars to what does each individual school need, given the children it's teaching, to make sure they get a great education. And I conceived of that idea in March 2008, and my school went live and all the rest of it, and it was on my final day as Prime Minister that the school funding legislation went through. So took a long time, took a lot of argument, took a lot of work. Where I think we made less good decisions is when we reacted quickly to events. Now, sometimes you've got no option but to react quickly to events. For example, I think we didn't have an option but to react quickly to events when there were instances of severe animal cruelty exposed in our live animal trade to Indonesia. But when you do things quickly, often there are a set of repercussions and consequences that you're then chasing, and the ball is rolling and you're not controlling its direction. So I'd contrast those two, setting the vision and then a very methodical pursuit of it over, making a decision. People would argue whether it was the right one or the wrong one, but then scrambling for a long period of time to deal with its consequences.
Thank you. And Alan, same question?
I need to give a little background before I explain a little thing that illustrates a whole lot of other things. When we set out to privatise the SEC, one reason we did that was to reduce state debt, and that's the thing that most people associate with the sale of the SEC. For the few of us in the middle working on getting it started and then carrying it out, that was an important objective, but far more important was creating a competitive market for electricity and creating a market where discipline was driven back through a utility industry to capture the benefit of abundant supplies of coal, leading to Victoria's being a low-cost producer of energy. Relative to many other jurisdictions, our energy costs were and still are relatively low, which gives us competitive advantage. Less so now when manufacturing has a whole lot of different dynamics. But there are a whole lot of things, and in particular, the idea of giving people more control over their lives. I remember one woman saying to me before we got into government that she'd had a long-running dispute with the SEC, and eventually she went into their customer service office, and the guy behind the counter got really angry, and eventually he said to her, "Look, if you don't like what we provide you, go somewhere else." Now, why could he say that? Because there wasn't anywhere else to go. You had one of the most highly vertically integrated energy markets in the world in one company, even through to the retailing of appliances. And the decision that makes me really happy in all of that might sound pretty trifling, but our advisors said to us universally, don't bother extending choice of retail supplier to individual households. There's not enough in it to make it worthwhile for them to put any effort into exercising the choice you give them, and they just won't do it. So we might as well forget them and focus on small business and up, and particularly the really large producers. And because of what I've just said to you about our key objective, I vehemently resisted that. over quite a long time because we did a lot of planning before we actually initiated the reforms. And I had endless arguments with all of our advisors, irrespective of their discipline. Our project management team, which was fantastic, the lawyers, the accountants, everybody argued against it. And I wonder, does anybody here today know in Victoria how many residential customers change their supplier each year? What percentage? Pardon me? 28%. And they don't all change because of price. They might change because their people keep cutting them off, as happens to my farm down on the Mornington Peninsula, or because they have a tree fall across the line and the company takes 3 days to repair it. Giving them the right to choose their supplier, pardon me, to say to one company, no, I don't want to deal with you anymore, I'm going somewhere else, has altered the relationship and altered the service levels in that industry. And that I regard as a really good decision. And if you want any verification of it, call Telstra. The dominant supplier of telecommunications in this company. I dealt with them today. They were very helpful, but it took 3/4 of an hour on the phone. And my wife refuses to deal with them because that's what happens every time you call them. In terms of bad decisions, can't really think of anything. I think this will sound weird, but I decided in '99 to leave politics. And I don't know what Julia's experience was, but for 2 years afterwards, I didn't read a newspaper. I couldn't stand watching current affairs programs. I was just totally exhausted in every dimension of your life. And then Nick Minchin rang me and he said, I want you to be president of the Liberal Party. And I had 6.5 years as president of the Liberal Party. We reformed the party a lot. We achieved a great deal, but it brought me back into the political world. And I really was tired of that. I provided the leadership I think they were looking for, and on some occasions, the difference between business and politics is that you have a hierarchical structure in business, and to a very large extent, what the boss says goes down the chain and people do what's asked of them. In politics, best described as herding cats, and you have huge egos and you have no real authority over them. It's the force of your own personality and the force of your arguments that wins them round. So it was a really exhausting process to go back into being president of the Liberal Party. And whilst I got a lot of satisfaction out of it, it took 6.5 years that in retrospect, I didn't really want to give up.
Good and bad decisions. I think we've moved really quite neatly into the notion of how we cope as leaders, or at least how you cope as leaders. And I was going to ask Chris Marlchrist if you could identify yourself. Chris, can you just ask the question you wanted to ask about competing priorities?
Hi. As busy leaders, obviously you've got competing events. I'm interested to know how you manage those events. You've got obligations, both personal and business. And I'm interested to know how you handle those.
Do you want to go first?
Well, I mean, we all carry our diary in our pocket now, and this is an incredibly sophisticated instrument. And I have a secretary, share of a secretary, but I don't use her. Because I work for such a large number of organisations, I make all my appointments, manage all my time with this iPhone. And in the narrow sense of how do you manage your time, I couldn't do it without that. If I was still in the days of paper diaries, I'd be going mad because lots of things get changed all the time. In terms of how do you manage the conflicts that come from all of those things, I don't mean a conflict of interest, but the conflicting demands, I think it's the same as anything else. You have to prioritise, and even if you only worked for one employer, or even if you were never in politics, you still have to prioritise what are the things I have to do now, what are the things that are really important that I must make sure I get done. The same guy I told you about who said to me, you must prepare, also said to me, you insult people if you're late. So I've always been a hound for punctuality and often get to things early. But I think it's just a matter of prioritising the whole raft of things. And that, I'm a list maker. I draw up lists, I think, in dot points. All of that helps, I think, in managing a lot of different demands on you. And sometimes you have to say to people, look, I know that's really important to you, but I'm sorry, I've committed to somebody else to do something at that time. And I don't really have much difficulty doing that. I think it's just a sensible and courteous thing to treat people with respect, to treat what they are asking of you with the respect it deserves, and to make sure it gets done.
Politics is a hard beast in the sense of managing your time, because there's precious few occasions where people receive no as the right answer. You know, no, I can't come visit your school. No, I can't go to your event. No, I won't, do the next media conference. So very difficult to manage those competing demands. I mean, as Prime Minister, because the volume of demands is such, you've actually got an internal system that involves both the department and your private office, trying to sort invitations and sort priorities, and then you put the, final shaping. I mean, you give guidance as to what the priorities are, and then you put the final shaping on what gets accepted and what gets declined. But in all of that, I think there is a tendency to undervalue time with family and respite time, and everybody thinks that they work amazingly well at 1,000,000 miles an hour, but in fact that's part of the delusion that comes with working at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And then if you allow yourself to have a little bit of a break, you recognise the difference between the delusion and reality. In politics, you don't really get to break the delusion all that much, so your life's time between family and work, for me, it's played out in a kind of linear life cycle fashion. So one of the reasons I moved back to Adelaide at the end of my time in politics is everything to do with our family's life for all of those years I've been gone has been done by my sister Alison, who stayed in Adelaide, and you get to the stage where you say, oh, it's my turn, so I've gone home. So, I've managed it that way, and the reality is in my years in politics, big things happened in our family, and I just couldn't be there for them, and I couldn't do any of the organising. And yes, I showed up for my niece's wedding, but I didn't do anything that made the wedding possible. Everybody else in the family did all of those things. So I've kind of budgeted my life's time like that. Now, that's not going to work for everyone. I think it's quite hard to do that balance, and everybody's got to find their own level. I actually think we've all got to probably practice saying no a bit more than we do, just so that we, get the level of energy and focus we need around the real things, and don't end up, in the late night or early morning commitments where really you're not functioning at your highest capacity. So is there that much point in being there? But all of that is far more easily said than done.
It's always a challenge, isn't it, balancing those things? I'm sure everybody feels those pressures in the room. But can I move on then to sort of leading as practice, really? So the practice of being a leader. And Amy Lismore, you were going to ask a question around how you trust other people to give you advice.
So obviously in your positions you're very much dependent on other people to make your success happen and realise that. So in terms of taking on advice from others, how do you manage the trust in those relationships, and then the complexity that comes with conflicting advice or conflicting points of view around that?
Well, I might try that first, and then I'll go to Alan. I think whether you're in politics, in business, in leadership, in so many ways, where the closest circle of advisors around you, you have got the power and capacity to select. The classic error is to select people that you feel really, really comfortable with because they're a lot like you, and to select people who are going to reflect back to you the things you've said, who don't have the personal wherewithal to speak truth to power. And so I think when you think of your chain of advisors, mentors, people that you go to and in whom you have a trusted relationship, you've actually got to put a bit of grit in the system deliberately. You've got to have some people in your circle who are very unlike you. Even some things, the way they process information and things like that, you can, find bordering on irritating. Actually, that's going to be a really good dynamic. So, I'm someone who likes to, think and work things through, and maybe it's linear, but I get there in the end. I've deliberately tried to surround myself at least with a few people who are those intuitive flash people that, 9 times out of 10 they're wrong, but that and the trick lies in knowing when they are. But the 10th time when they're right, you say, I would never have come up with that in a million years. That's a blinding bloody insight. And the fact I've had to listen to you speak rubbish 9 times out of 10 is now justified. And you're the little bit of grit in the system. So I just think that, the complexity of human relationships and making sure that it's in its own way. I always viewed my office as, we were almost like my private office, my most trusted advisors, I always viewed it almost like a big dysfunctional family. Dysfunctional in the sense that there were a lot of sometimes odd relationships and odd moments, but the fact there was variety and a cacophony and sometimes a lot of loud voices, actually out of that process you generated a lot of good creative tension and consequently at the end of it, very good advice.
You've created some big concerns for all of us in the room now, Julia, because we all belong to management teams and we're all thinking we're the grit in the system. Alan?
It's an interesting question because of the use of 2 words. One is trust and the other is advice. I think the way you trust people is that they prove to be trustworthy. And there's a life lesson in that trust is hard won. It takes a while to build trust, but it is very easily lost. And if you find people who are not trustworthy, who go behind your back, who say different things to your face from what they say to other people, then that trust is lost. And it's very rare to really get it back. So I think to be trustworthy yourself is a critical step in building trust in other people because it's mutual. You trade trust. And if people think that you're not trustworthy, they're less likely to provide you with the basis for trusting them. So I think the concept of trust is incredibly important. The other word is advice, and I think it's critical to just stop for a moment and think what that means. You're the decision maker and somebody else is giving you advice. I think it's critical, as Julia said, not to have a blancmange, not to have people who just slap you on the back and tell you how good you are all the time. And there are people like that, and there are people, particularly in bureaucracies, who will tailor their advice to what they think you want to hear, rather than giving you frank and fearless advice. Now, there's a line there. No bureaucrat's going to come and give advice he knows a government won't accept, but people need to be challenged. And I think when you receive advice, you should try to get more than one source of advice so that you're not dependent just on the wit and the knowledge and the experience of one particular person, but you're gathering the experience of a whole lot of different people. And even when you're under pressure to make decisions, I still think it's worthwhile hearing the advice, but then maybe having a bit of a group think about it and find out, does somebody else have a completely different view? So balancing advice from one source with advice from other sources. But in the end, you're the decision maker and you need to scrutinise the advice you're given, think about it, question it, probe it. Think, do you think it will work? Because if they had all the superior knowledge, they'd probably be where you are. If you're the decision maker, Other people are putting their trust in you to make the right decision. And I think you have to apply your own mind, and particularly if it's big issues, the sort of things we've talked about as major public policy, don't rush to judgment. Take the time to mull it over yourself and think about it and get advice from a whole lot of sources. Recognising some people have vested interest, and you might discount their advice for that reason if you think they're just pushing their own barrow. After a while, you become able to make those judgments, and I think you value advice, but you never just take it because it's been given to you. You always want to scrutinise it.
Alan, can I just pick you up on something there that fascinates me? This morning we heard from Professor Peter Leahy, who was the former Chief of Army, talking about his experience as an army leader, really, and commander. But one of the points he made was how lonely leadership can be. And you were talking then about people, you don't just want people around you who pat you on the back and tell you what a good job you're doing, but do you need some of that? How do you keep your confidence as a leader when you're being critiqued all the time?
Well, I've chaired companies, but I've never been at the pinnacle like Julia and Jeff Kennett, for example, each in their own spheres. So I'm not 100% sure I'm equipped to answer that, because I've always felt like I'm part of a team. I think one of my strengths has been building teams and putting good people together in teams. And 3 or 4 times in my life, I've done really big things. Put your hand over your ears for a moment. Together with a team of lawyers, I ran the Builders Labourers Federation deregistration case in the federal court, where I represented every private employer in Australia, and there was another guy representing the public employers who subsequently became a judge, a guy named Chris Jessup, and up through Stephen Charles, very eminent lawyer, led the whole pyramid. And
supported that. Relax.
Well, unfortunately, as Labor governments were elected around the country, as we are likely to do from time to time, they all withdrew from the case, and it came to John Cain to deregister the union. But it was a great experience. It ran over about 2.5 years, and it was a fantastic learning experience to be the most junior of the junior barristers in that. I worked buying Sydney Airport for Macquarie Bank, and I co-led that bid, but it was very, very definitely a big team, and everybody saw themselves as part of a team. And the Kennett government cabinet was a fantastic team. We'd unfortunately had the experience, most of us had been working together in opposition for 8 years, which is a very, very long time to hold a team together. But in government, the esprit de corps through that group and the mutual support and the identification with the policies each minister was pursuing in a government where the ministers drove the reforms, not the bureaucrats, that team experience was fantastic. And I must say, I've never felt that sort of loneliness. I consider that I'm not there on my own. I've got this whole team, and you've got an expanded team outside that. And I remember Don Hayward, who was our education minister, fantastic education minister, used to come and sit in my office and just talk to me about policy issues and kick things around with me. And that's the sort of team I feel you should try to build, where people who've got a responsibility that you're not directly responsible for still feel it's a good idea to come and just chew the fat with you. And I must say, I've never felt that loneliness.
Julia, I mean, you've probably forgotten, but there were a few moments in your premiership where the press were quite ferocious.
Seriously?
How did you maintain your confidence as a leader?
Sure. Well, I mean, just on that question of loneliness, I think I think I can understand what Peter was saying to the group, and at that, absolute kind of, whether it's leading the Defence Force or leading the government, the nation as Prime Minister, what Jeff did here in Victoria. Tony Blair, the former UK Prime Minister, is fond of saying, if you decide, you divide. Now, that isn't necessarily true in all contexts, because if you work in a business and you've all decided, you know, this is our business vision, this is our business strategy, and you're making decisions consistent with that, then the team stays together and you do things together. But in politics, it can be true in contested spaces. It can be true, and our society throws up a lot of contested spaces. And if you've got the responsibility of making decisions in those contested spaces, then it's inevitable that some people will agree with you and some people will not. So if it's your obligation to decide, then you'll divide. And, you know, being able to sustain that requires firstly a confidence in the decision you've made. If you divide and then you start having second thoughts and thinking, maybe I got that wrong, clearly you're not going to be able to see it through. So you've got to have a confidence in the decision. And then the other thing I think you've got to have, and obviously I experienced this at a national, very exposed level, but everybody experiences it to some extent, particularly in these days of social media. You don't have to be a politician or whatever to read some, very critical things about yourself, often online, anonymity of Twitter, all of that. People will say the most horrible things. And I think it's important for everyone in this day and age to have a very clear, nurtured sense of self, who you really are. I had to think about that very deeply. I had to understand who I really was, and I was the same Julia Gillard on a day I'd wake up to, good polls and good newspaper headlines, as I was on the day that I woke up to bad polls and bad newspaper headlines. I hadn't undergone some fundamental character transformation. I was still the same bundle of strengths and weaknesses that I always was, and so you had to almost third person it. So know who you really were and view that noise, static, horrible things on social media as a problem to be looked at and resolved, but emotionally you had to disconnect as if it was happening about someone else. And my colleagues would all often talk about my sense of calm when we were dealing with some of those situations, and I think that was that was the driver of the sense of calm, that you didn't let yourself emotionally connect with it. And at the end of the day, some of the most, criticism hurts the most if it comes from people who you know really well and who you respect. That's the really hurtful criticism, the time that someone you've worked with a long time and you really trust, or your sister or your best friend says, look, this is going to be a hard conversation, but I've been meaning to tell you this for quite a long time. That can really hurt. What some idiot thinks on Twitter on Saturday night after they've downed 2 bottles of red wine, like, can we really care? How much emotional anxiety do you want to put yourself through because of that? My answer is 0. Yeah.
Thank you. The social media comment's actually a very useful one, because Benjamin Kilpatrick, are you here, Benjamin? Yeah, you had a couple of questions. I wonder if I could get you to ask the question that you really wanted to ask around working online and the sort of emotional intelligence issue that you had.
Yeah. So there's been a fair amount of academic study which focuses on defining characteristics of successful leaders, about having emotional intelligence, and really understanding individual team members and what motivates them. I guess my question is, how do you think future leaders can adapt these skills, given the technology improvements and enhancements mean that people don't always have face-to-face contact with their teams? And I guess how that impacts their direct sort of human interaction and relationships that they manage to build.
That's quite a tough one to answer, but I think it's quite an important one to our students, because they are working in remote teams quite a lot of the time, and I think that even politics is moving in that direction increasingly. Yeah, I wouldn't accept the proposition that you can't read emotion
through interactions that happen online. I think you read it differently, and yes, there's human beings face to face. We are reacting to each. There's all the non-verbal clues that help you work out if someone's agitated or happy or relaxed or whatever. And I think people with good emotional intelligence are very good at reading those cues. So yes, you don't have that, but if you're emailing back and forth, to give one example, I mean, our some of the most great and profound parts of our culture are works of literature which, move you, reduce you to laughter or tears, and you never meet the author. You're reading his or her writings, and yet they're profoundly moving and they've got emotion in them. Now, I know when you're sitting at your desk in the office, you're not trying to, here's my version of War and Peace for the day, and then this happened and then that happened. But I think people do inject, parts of themselves into those communications, and I think that can be read by the receiver of it. And I might optimistically predict, I'm not 100% sure of this, but I'll chance my arm, that maybe you're better at that than I am because you're younger than I am and it's been part of your world for longer. And maybe the generation that's in preschool today are going to be even better at it than you because they'll be immersed in it from, the absolute get-go. And so in the way in which I, as a child, learned to read visual communications from other human beings about whether they were happy or sad, that the ability of people to read those things through online platforms will actually get better and better across the generations.
Thank you. Alan, do you want to have a think about this?
I want to say something slightly different, but I want to start by saying that I think that modern communications technologies have the opportunity to give people a richer, more diverse experience than they would have if they were physically present at something. And we've talked over the last couple of weeks, for example, about my trying to persuade the National Gallery here in Victoria to put its major collection online and make it available for students in a classroom in Mildura, where they could have a much richer experience of a work of art, learn more about it, except for the sense of actually physically standing in front of it. So I don't want to be thought to be criticising the value of online technologies, online learning, all of the things that are opening up now, because I think the potential is way in excess even of what we're doing right now. But I think it is true that except at the extremes, if you don't know people well, if you're somebody you don't know, if you're at Beyond Blue and somebody you never heard of, don't know about at all, sends you a message of absolute despair in an email, you can recognise that. But the nuances that we all get from the way people put things in their body languages are much harder to get in an online community. And for that reason, I think it's really important that if you're working as a team, whilst virtually all of your communication might be online because you're emailing each other over anything that's of any significance, it's very important that at some time you come physically together and you get some sort of feel for people. Where we deal with people we don't know at all, there's no way of getting around that, and I think we do inevitably sacrifice something. If we're providing a service, we can't understand the nuances that we would understand if somebody was sitting on the opposite side of a table or a counter from us. But I agree with Julia, English, particularly the English language, is a remarkable means of communication. And as I get older, I find I'm much more apt to burst out laughing or even have tears in my eyes about something I'm reading than even in a movie. So I think there are limitations on emotional communication, your ability to use your emotional intelligence, and you should compensate for that by developing personal relationships as well.
Thank you. Can we just move across just briefly to talk about how transferable the skills you learn as a leader in one place are to another place? So,
Sorry, how
transferable the skills are. Ryan Wynne, you were going to ask a question around this.
Hi, thank you. I guess I wanted to explore how you've had to transfer or what adjustments you've had to do around your leadership style between a corporate space, being a government minister, and ultimately leading political parties.
Well, I'd put your question much broader than that. I think as a human being, you develop abilities, memories, aptitudes, judgment through your whole life experience. And sure, the political experience is very valuable, and for some of the reasons Julia gave, if you're at the top, it's very intense and you learn a great deal about yourself and about a whole lot of other things. But I must say I'm constantly amazed when I'm having brainstorming sessions with people or somebody comes to me with a strategic problem, how much I know. If you ask me to sit down and write it in a book, there's no way I would write it up. But my mind will call up things that if I were asked what happened on, in such and such a year, I'd never remember it. But because it's relevant to what we're talking about, it'll come either as something that informs a judgment or something that allows you to communicate why that judgment should be made. So I think all of our life is experience, and it's all valuable, and it all automatically transfers onto whatever you're dealing with. And sure, you've got to recognise the differences. I pointed out to you before that in a business, you do have to motivate people, but in the end, you can tell them that's the way it's going to be. Whereas in a political party, or particularly a political extra-parliamentary organisation, you don't have line authority virtually over anybody. So you've always got to cajole and persuade and massage egos. But I think in doing that, you draw on your whole life experience. And I think all those skills and aptitudes and knowledge and all that judgment, your mind automatically brings to bear.
I'd certainly agree with that. I mean, the benefit of getting to live a longer time is you bring more context to decision making, and so there's no substitute for putting in the years to get there. So let that be a lesson to you. The other thing I think is, and there's actually some health research where they have interviewed people about levels of happiness across their lives at different age ranges, interviewed people, and you might intuitively think, younger people are happier than older people because they've got their whole life ahead of them and they're, tending to be fitter and more able and more agile, so why wouldn't you be happier? But actually this research shows that it's people towards the end of their lives that actually have the self-reported highest levels of happiness. And why is that? Maybe they're at peace with what they've done in their lives, so instead of being anxious about expectations of the future, they can reconcile with what's happened in the past. But the other thing I think is they've had enough experience that things that loom large as a crisis when you're younger are like, oh, what are you worried about when you're older? And one thing I would certainly say for myself, I think I've always been a relatively even-tempered, calmer personality than some of the more volatile in the political scene. But that behaviour is in part innate and it's in part learned, and the more you do, the more you learn it. So anything in my life now that others might think, oh my God, that is, a whole lot of pressure, I am by definition kind of, you got to know what pressure looks like. It doesn't look like this. I think that gives you the ability to, stop sweating some of the smaller things, get more focused on some of the bigger things. So those skills, I think, some practical skills about time management and making sure you've thought through your vision and your mission and your purpose and, sorting through priorities and managing people. I think you take those skills with you from place to place and job to job, activity to activity, activity, but then there's a set of, sort of softer skills within you that develop over time the more leading you do.
So I'm even older than Julia. I would have to add, though, it doesn't always mean you get it right. And I often have experiences where I think, gee, I wish I'd thought of that.
Yeah, yes.
That's almost back to that first question, Alan. Jennifer Flew, you were going to ask a question around breadth and depth of knowledge.
You've touched a little on my next question, talking about experience and, I guess, relying on your team. But can you give us a little advice about when you move from an area that you have an in-depth knowledge in to moving to another position where you may have to have knowledge about a range of different areas?
This experience is common to politics because, ministries get reshuffled, and in an instant you go from being the Minister for Health to the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations or whatever, and you've got to entirely learn, so you bring your public policy skills, but you've got to entirely learn a new area. So politics does provide this experience. I've someone who's always liked that challenge of a whole area, a whole new thing to learn about, and I don't think that there's any way to do it except to immerse yourself in it. So to give you a real world example of that, I volunteered to take the immigration portfolio in opposition after we lost the 2001 election. I wasn't fighting people off with a stick. In fact, I was the only person who volunteered because it had been, the election, the Tampa had been that year, asylum seeker policy, very controversial within Labor. And I figured to myself, politics isn't about volunteering for the easy stuff, it's about volunteering for the hard stuff. And I wasn't career naive either. I knew that compared with what would be identified as an easier area, it would make or break my political career. So if I got it right, it would make me. I needed, with no run-up, other than doing, occasional, you get, as a local member of parliament, you get constituent cases about immigration issues, and having been a participant in the electoral cycle as a member of parliament that year, off that scant knowledge, had to get myself across everything, and there was just no substitute for months and months spent reading, meeting every stakeholder, listening to what they had to say, reading some more, then having more challenging meetings with those stakeholders where you'd be pushing them to the next level of detail or challenging them about some propositions they were putting to you, so you could just get more and more sophisticated about your level of knowledge. But I think that's kind of an exciting process because whenever I've had to go through it, there's been the everything looks like a muddle in the middle phenomenon where there's the moment where you think, oh my God, I'm never going to understand this. I'm never going to be expert in it. People keep saying things that are apparently blindingly obvious to everybody else, and I've never heard anybody say them before, and it just feels horrible. And then there's the moment where the light bulb really goes on, and you've got the satisfaction of having mastered the material.
Thank you. Alan,
I entirely agree. I think that constantly shifting from one really important topic to another is one of the great attractions of politics, and thing you look back on and think that was really great. In 1996, I'd been Shadow Treasurer and then Treasurer for a combination of 11 years, and I said to Jeff Kennett, if we're returned to government, I want a different portfolio. And he said, well, you're not getting a different portfolio, but I'll give you an additional portfolio. So the additional portfolio was Minister for IT and Multimedia. And I have to tell you, I had to go to the dictionary and look up what internet meant. So that was a really confronting experience, and I could not agree more with Julia. I'd say 4 things though. 1, you are absolutely blessed in immersing yourself with the internet. You can Google anything. And even I, at my age, now if I find something I don't understand, I Google it. And I look around for an explanation that seems to be well sourced and well documented and makes sense to me. So first of all, do the work, find out about it, online as well as in print. The second thing, surround yourself with really good people who work in that field. And I was extraordinarily lucky that an RMIT professor decided to take me under his wing when I became Minister for Multimedia. I can't even remember how I met him. Robin Williams, I think was his name, not the Robin Williams, and he was incredibly helpful to me. Together, I'd recommend you read a mystery book called The Cuckoo's Egg, which is about how people hacked into mainframes in the old days, and I learned a huge amount about computers from reading that. Surround yourself with good people. Then build an inner team that you can really trust and that you know knows that business and who will help you. And then if you're a politician, resist the guilt, stamp on any guilt, and take credit for their work too.
Alan, I think that you couldn't have summarised the lessons of the whole of the day better than that, actually. I think those are the things, maybe not the last point, but the other 3 points, I think, are ones which we've all been taking to heart as we go through the day. I'm aware that we've run out of time. I would have liked to have invited some more questions from the floor, but I think that certainly Julie has said she's going to stay around for an hour, and I think Alan's got some time to stay around, so there will be opportunities for you all to sort of sidle up alongside, get the selfie phone out and ask a question. But can I finish by saying that I think that what we're trying to do at the University of Canberra in partnership with Ducere is actually to be innovative, to have an MBA that is about innovation and leadership, and to finish our first ever day of conference with 2 amazing speakers like this has just been such a great privilege. I feel so honoured to be part of this programme and to be actually leading it from the university's point of view. And I'm very grateful for both of you for giving up the time this evening to be with us and for the insights you've given us. So can I ask everybody to join me in thanking you.
Just wanted to say another huge thank you for KPMG for hosting, and they're also putting on some canapes and drinks for everyone. So your Friday night has finally started and you can have a beer. And just thank you again to our panellists, to Alan and Julia. I think for both as students and guests and for all of us, there's both inspirational insights there. The chance to learn from both of you is a wonderful opportunity. And there's also a lot of great sort of practical insights there, which from day one on Monday morning, I think everyone can start applying to their workplace to start increasing the value that everyone's adding, and that's amazing as well. And thank you to Lawrence for chairing what was a wonderful discussion. So I hope to speak to you all this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.